Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. Hey everyone, this is your host, Various Artists, and welcome to another MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'd like to remind everyone to like, follow, and subscribe on Facebook and Instagram, and you can also read the original blog entry on the MyLifeInConcert.com website. So, last time in episode 7, I looked at the second gig proper that I had ever been to in 1978, following my first show, Roxy Music, in 75, and it was Bob Seger at the London Gardens in May of 78. And in the episode, I talked mostly about how punk, new wave, and the new music scene phased out sort of the old midway through 1978 and sort of really focusing on the new. And the Seger show provided that final acceleration needed to finally and firmly cross that line. I also discussed a hugely impactful trip to the UK in 1977, and it had been so exciting being there at the height of the initial punk explosion, seeing it all play out, and I thought that it would be happening here anytime soon. Today, I'll be talking about the second of two shows that I saw in 1978, one that finally reflected what I was listening to now at that time. And also, this was a concert with many firsts. So, welcome to episode 8, concert number 3, this year's model, Elvis Costello and the Attractions with the Battered Wives, Alumni Hall, University of Western Ontario, London, Ontario, Canada, Monday, November 6th, 1978. Also, my teenage friend from public school and some high school years, even though we were going to different high schools, Autobahn, that's the name I've assigned him. Autobahn will be dropping by later in the podcast. He came to this show with me. This was his first show. And so he'll be sharing his memories, and stay tuned, he'll be coming up later. Now, this show took place just 6 months after the Bob Seger gig, and at this point, the idea of going to see Seger would have been unthinkable for me. The difference just a few months can make when you're younger. But anyway, the line had been crossed, and what would have seemed natural a few months ago was I was now past that. I was no longer interested. It's the fall of 1978, and I had banished the old wave almost completely from my then current playlist, except for those handfuls that would never go away, that the Stones, Lou Reed, the Kinks, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, that sort of thing. They were all there, but a lot of the more middle-of-the-road stuff that I'd picked up in the middle of the 70s was pretty much vanquished forever. And a lot of the older acts from the 60s that maybe weren't doing stuff or stuff I wasn't as into, I pretty much came back round to them. But at this point, it was a time when this kind of music, the scene, it was all completely new. It had never happened. It was extremely exciting. And there were so many amazing albums that came out in the fall of 78. The one more than any other for me was Blondie's Parallel Lines, which I remember coming out right at the end of September, right alongside the Ramones' Road to Ruin, another favorite that defines that fall. But Blondie's Parallel Lines, that was the album that completely, it defined it. I was obsessed with it all the way through. And then, of course, the next year it blew up over in North America. It had already been a big hit in Europe and Australia, but that's the key one. But there's so many others. The Ramones' Road to Ruin, as I was saying. Devo's debut, Question, Are We Not Men? We Are Devo, which sort of went on a stranger, artier angle. The Jam, who I bought in the city in the UK the previous summer, and that was kind of the first punk album that I bought. And by the way, the Jam are coming up next in this series, and definitely come back for that gig. Wow. There was also the Boomtown Rats' second album, A Tonic for the Troops. They're also coming up a few gigs down the line. Sham 69's debut, Tell Us the Truth. So really exciting time with all this new music. And then there was all these great singles. that came out at that time. Susie and the Banshees finally put out their debut with Hong Kong Garden. Still to this day, one of my favorite singles of the 1970s. Also, a little bit later, but Lydon came back from the Pistols with that first Public Image PIL single, which was incredible. And I still have my, unfortunately, disintegrating newspaper sleeve of that one. Also, too, of course, that was the Sid Vicious' My Way on the double A side with No One Is Innocent with Ronnie Biggs and the Sex Pistol. That was out then, which I loved at the time, but now it's just more silly. And also locally, one of the first bands from the local area, Teenage Head, initially from Hamilton, then Toronto, released their debut 45 in the fall of 78, Picture My Face, and for my money, it was a sterling recording they never equaled. Still a killer 45, and tearing me apart on the B-side. It's also when I play catch-up with a few albums from the past year or so that I had just gotten, most notably the Clash's debut. For some reason, that was one of the last ones that I bought. I don't know why, but it's one of my favorite albums of all time, and I played the shit out of that one through the fall. Also, Wire's Pink Flag, which some ways you could almost argue it was the first post-punk album, but that was another one I bought that had a big impact. And one I liked a lot at the time, it's more of a sort of rough and fun one now, was the Roxy London compilation of the different punk bands playing at the famed short-lived club and the live album that came from it. Actually, one of my favorite things on that album are the chunks between the tracks where they had put tape recorders around the club and in the Roxy bathroom. And so you just have all the ambient conversations going on around you. So an incredible time with all this new music that had never been before. Now, I was just talking about the Roxy, which was one of the first punk clubs in London. Now, I hadn't seen any bands in bars, and I didn't until 1979, because I was, 15 at this point? And also, I was a very young-looking 15. I've always looked kind of younger than my years, which really sucked when I wanted to get into bars. As I get older, I see it as an advantage now. So this show, this Elvis Costello show, was my first direct interface, one of the many firsts coming up, my first direct interface with the new music I had been voraciously and gleefully devouring. And again, it was so exciting to have this happening, this rush of adrenaline. I've always liked many different types of music, and I mean, I listen to a lot of chill-out stuff, but one of the things that's always going to be this visceral love for me is that raw, aggressive guitar rock, more on the harsh, noisy, dissonant side. You know, it doesn't have to be vanilla. And with a lot of high-energy rock, you know, sometimes imperfect and sloppy is part of it. For me, it's more about mood, energy, ideas, and enthusiasm paired with hooky, killer tunes. And for some reason, almost no one can do that today. Very few. And I'd like to see that come back. But what was once happening in abundance, comes and goes, I guess. All I know is that even now, that kind of music, it just makes me feel alive, and it's one of my musical home bases. I also like the general creativity and also the humor around it. The scene was really inaccurately portrayed in a lot of mass media, and a lot of the tongue-in-cheek humor was completely lost on a lot of people, and I'll be talking a bit more about that in a couple of episodes down the line. But for those of us who were involved and became part of that, it was indescribably and unalterably liberating. It certainly changed how I look at a lot of things, and not just in terms of ideas about music, but about ideas in general. I just became much more open to unorthodox approaches, ways of thinking in general. It gave me new questions to ask and new perspectives to ponder. And I feel that while my life is very different in many ways today from that time, indeed, that period and many of the related experiences I had during the next few years continue to inform who I am now. Certainly, you had to have balls to be openly into punk rock, or the then emerging term new wave. It's just part of the culture now and part of the history, and its impact and influence is acknowledged, but at the time, it gets forgotten. People simply did not accept it, to put it mildly. and reacted violently to it. I used to receive death threats in high school, but instead of backing down or tempering things, as I may have done in the past, I stood my ground and learned of my own power in the process. In doing so, I made a big discovery that has guided me through life, and that is a lot of the biggest loudmouths are all talk. And once you realize those sorts of things, that's liberating as well. Anyway, so punk in many ways was the first step in me building my personal confidence. So at this point, I had now gotten rid of the mid-70s fro, which I had into 77. I had a major serious fro in the 70s. Indeed, my natural hair is very curly, and I used to anger a lot of people then because they would say, where do you get your hair perm? Like, this is 75, 76, but also even 77 I had it. And it would be, no, this is just my natural hair. And it would be, I hate you. And meanwhile, what I wanted was dead straight hair, especially at that time. I was glad I had the afro, but once punk came in and that sort of thing, I just wanted to spike my hair out. Now I just solved the problem by shaving it all off, which I've done for decades. But yeah, mid-70s, big fro, denim vest, flared jeans, clogs, afro pick in my back pocket. You got it. So in 78, I had my first real sort of quote-unquote short haircut. When I look at my hair now in that picture, it still looks long to me. But in 78 in London, the culture and the look hadn't really shifted in years. It was shags. It's still all that. So in that context, when I see it, it was very short. And it was like, the reaction I got from people, because it was just completely opposite to what the rest of the culture was doing. But again, I look at it now and it's like, it's not really short. I shave my head all the time, so anything is longer, but you know what I mean. So the show itself was staged at Alumni Hall, a 2,300-seater venue with great acoustics on the campus of the University of Western Ontario. I know this was the first time in that hall. I think it was probably also my first time on the University of Western campus, and that was 1978. Starting 9 years later, I would end up spending enormous amounts of time there for many, many years, and actually began DJing at the university station there in 84. But at this point, again, it was new. So first time in Alumni Hall, which I'll be returning to many times in this series, and also my first time seeing a concert in a concert hall. The other one were at these big sheds, arena sheds, and this was a seated, reasonably sized, not too big but not tiny concert hall. And so that was very neat to see a show with a more intimate audience. And as you'll see in the next three shows get smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's an interesting experience. And of course, you're experiencing it all new when you're younger. Now, back to Alumni. I also want to talk about the venues that I saw the shows in over the course of the series, and there's a few that come up repeatedly. This is certainly one of them. And I've got to say about Alumni, it really is a killer hall to see a show in from the acoustic standpoint, even the sight lines, because it kind of has that bowl effect. But it's a really nice size hall with beautiful acoustics, and that place really served as a contrast to Centennial Hall downtown, where I already talked about in episode 3, the Ramones were there. And Centennial Hall will be coming up several times. And I believe Centennial Hall now has worked on a lot of the sound issues. So, but back in the day, it was built in 67 for the Centennial, and through the 70s, it sounded terrible. And Alumni just had this beautiful sound. While I was excited to be finally seeing a new wave act or whatever, and that is just it. I realized this wasn't going to be a punk rock concert. Costello was more of a great tunesmith who was edgy. It just wasn't Sham 69. Still, I remember there being hysteria amongst the ass-clamped citizenry of old Londonia that a riot was going to happen at this gig or something to that effect. And it was a big deal. People thought things were going to go absolutely well. This is Elvis Costello, okay? There's going to be a lot of people bopping around to great tunes. But again, this was all new, and especially over here, people just didn't know what to make of almost any of this. And because of this nonsense, there was a ton of security there. It's just funny to think about. The concerned university stepped up the number of Biff and Buffy student rent-a-cops for the evening to keep things in order should something happen, like, a lot of people pogoing around at the front of the stage. And a bunch of fans did rush the stage when Costello came on. And of course, security initially tried preventing it, but they eventually stopped being a buzzkill and relented and, realized it was futile. And all they did is it was just people dancing around in the front of the stage. Everything was fine. Now, I was very, very geared up about seeing Costello. Now, I'd first heard him 14 months earlier on that trip to the UK that I discussed in the Seger entry. When I was there in August of 77, August and September, My Aim Is True had just been released and had gotten rapturous response in the UK music press and was entering the British charts. And it became part of me. I want to hear this album before I leave the country. As I talked then, I spent a lot of time, my parents would be off shopping or somewhere, and I would head to a record store or a record department and just hanging out in there with the people working there, of course, wanting to, usually they're big music fans and they're curious about the newest stuff. So you hang out in those stores. I got to hear all sorts of artists for the first time there. The Stranglers, the Adverts, the Boys, Mink DeVille, blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, I remember we were in Southampton. And I went into a record store and someone put it on. It was like, yes! And I hung out in the store. I think my parents were shopping for like 2 hours and I just stayed in there. They played that and the first Boys album after, which was okay, but it wasn't Elvis Costello. And so I hung out and listened to it. It was just completely knocked out. I remember right now, it's in my head looking through all the racks and listening to the album going, oh man, this is good. And so and then the following week, because over in the UK, Watching the Detectives was a standalone single. It was tacked on the end of side 1 over here on the North American release, but it wasn't on the album there. And a week later, I heard the Watching the Detective single in a Boots record bar up north. That and Something Better Change by the Stranglers on the same day. So I came back to Canada singing the praises of this Elvis Costello guy, among others that I'd heard there. But he was one of the new acts that had most impressed me when I heard him. And at some point that fall, I noticed that it had been released over here in Columbia, and I picked it up sometime in and around there. So while lumped in with the punk crowd, his more palatable style of music made North American chart inroads that the Sex Pistols just couldn't, as Nevermind the Bollocks came out and barely dented the top 100 on this side of the pond. Now, of course, Nevermind the Bollocks would go on, well, in Britain and Europe, it was a big immediate success. Over here, it was a slow building one. It's one of those records that was bought by generation and generation and ended up as a multi-platinum seller over time, over a slow burn time. Whereas Costello did actually make inroads and was in the charts here. And after seeing what was happening in England and the excitement around it, I thought, okay, well, punk is now going to explode here too. Whoopsie daisy on that prediction. And then there was, of course, the infamous Saturday Night Live appearance on December of 1977, where he stood in for the Sex Pistols. So the week had been about seeing the Sex Pistols live on Saturday Night Live, and I had just been salivating over this. Tune in, and they had this elderly woman hosting. She had won a contest, anyone can host SNL. And then they announced the musical guest, and it's Elvis Costello. And of course, we later found out the Pistols couldn't get work visas in time to appear on the show. So right away, it was like, oh shit, I don't get to see the Sex Pistols, but yes, it's Elvis Costello. Wow. And of course, he came out and he famously cut short Less Than Zero, which he started playing, and he charged into the anti-commercial radio diatribe, Radio, his new single back in the UK, that he had been explicitly told not to play. So Lorne Michaels famously was ripping his hair out and vowed to never have him back. But of course, years later, they kissed and made up, and Elvis has returned to SNL many, many times. skip ahead many months, and during a wonderfully hot, sunny May of 1978, the same month of the Seger steam bath, Elvis Costello's second album and his first with backing band The Attractions, This Year's Model, was released in North America to an even more enthusiastic reception than its predecessor. I bought it the week of its release, and it immediately took up semi-resonance on my turntable. Ironically, it got into an elbowing contest at Chunks with another album at the time, the North American debut by This Year's Model's producer, Nick Lowe, and his Pure Pop for Now People. It was Jesus of Cool in the UK, and it was Pure Pop for Now People here with a different set list. Anyway, that first Nick Lowe album is just killer. First two in particular, just great. Now, one really cool thing about my copy of This Year's Model is because it was a first pressing, and I didn't realize this was limited until years later, is it's on Columbia Records over here, and at the time with the Columbia label, is the word Columbia went round in a circle around the outer rim of the label. Well, on the early This Year's Model pressings here, it says Costello instead of Columbia. And I know a few years ago, I was at a record, sort of a record show, and I saw a copy on sale and was quite pleased at the price it was selling for. This Year's Model was a big commercial success, and by the time of this late fall gig, and because he'd blown up so much over here, I sensed a bit of a backlash, fatigue from a lot of the core group of people who had initially discovered and supported him. This was my first introduction to a concept that I've repeatedly run into sort of in alternative music, hipster land, just sort of alternative circles. And this is the thing I don't like about the world. And it's the thing where it's that instant resentment of an artist once said artist achieves some level of success and they cease being merely somebody's private pet and instead have to be shared with the grubby lumpen proletariat. I have never gotten that way of thinking. I just don't get it and see it as a weakness. I enjoy it when acts I like get popular. I'd rather see and hear the stuff that I like rather than what I don't. And also, why should only the most obvious stuff be popular? Artists need to have an income too. And, think about what we're going through with COVID. This is really hitting artists who these days make their money through touring. And so why be selfish? I like progressive and radical ideas becoming part of the public conversation. So the whole thing about, they're popular now, I don't like them, kind of says that says to me you're really not that invested in the music. It's more about dropping the right names. I now realize that a lot of that way of thinking, it's down to people's insecurities. So I just give that way of thinking no quarter and pay no mind. So there, I also threw in some Led Zeppelin Beck references too. So the overall mood of the audience, kind of my feeling, or, it could be projecting from who I was with and what I knew. But there was this sense of energy and excitement that was cut decisively by sort of a boredom and detachment. Stupid shit. The joys of being older and not having that crap around. So it was strange to have this high energy show, but yet feeling there was this sort of ennui and detachment. Because funnily enough, that's precisely how I would characterize Costello's performance of that night. But before Costello made his appearance, first came the controversial opening band from Toronto, the Battered Wives. And to think in last episode 7, I winced at the name Toby Bow. Now, of course, it was the punk era and a lot of black humor and things being challenged. And, occasionally there's things where you look back, there was a line that was crossed. And I remember at the time there was a lot of controversy about the name, and I kind of saw it as sort of the punk black humor thing. But within about a year, it's like, okay, you know what? This one crosses the line. I was wrong on this one. This is just kind of like the Moors Murderers. It's like, okay, maybe not this one. So, there's just nothing funny about wife abuse or female battery or battery of anyone of any gender. even if they kind of tried to do the role reverse thing, because on the back, of course, they're the ones who have been beaten up by a dominatrix, which unfortunately foreshadows Spinal Tap. But it sunk them. And it was a really bad choice, because otherwise they were good. They were actually a really tight band. And they just released a promising debut album. But again, actually, the name was a lot harsher than what the band were. Really, they were a power pop band, more in the vein of Costello, and had a few songwriters and did a lot of well-crafted, spiky, hooky guitar pop. And they changed their name just to the Wives by the second album, but it's too late. The damage was done, and also the follow-up wasn't very good. So when it came time for them to go on stage, there had been this build up that things would go absolutely wild when this band came on. Again, this is essentially power pop. They came out, played a tight set, got applause, and left. And people were then focusing on Costello. It was very non-eventful. Now, one of my personal memories for the evening is from that between set period. And I can't recall how long the wait was, but what I remember was early in that day, I'd gone to the dentist at the Pellark building down on Warcliffe, not wildly far from where I live now. And I had gotten a filling, and of course I had freezing with the filling. And the freezing started to really come undone during this time of the night, and the nerve pain was starting. And I mentioned earlier at the Seger show, and this year I had started to partake in the herbal varieties, and joints were being passed around. And that's the night I realized this stuff actually does have medicinal properties, as all the ringing pain in my mouth subsided prior to Elvis coming onto the stage. Now, eventually Costello came on, and of course he was greeted by that aforementioned stage rush. And I can't remember the opening number or the exact set list, but I do remember that he played for just over an hour or so, which was much shorter than the other two gigs that I'd seen. The tune I definitely remember from the evening and being impressed by was I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. Now, it had appeared on the UK edition of this year's model and had recently been released as a single in Canada. I hadn't heard it yet, but kept reading about it and heard it was a great tune. And then when he did it, I just really liked it. The rhythm was very different. It's sort of odd, insistent rhythm. And I just remember thinking, I've got to get this. And I went out and picked up the 45 right after the gig. Now, at this point, I'd like to bring my old friend Autobahn into the picture. Now, we met in public school here in London, Ontario, in Huron Heights, Evelyn Harrison Public School, and were great friends through the latter part of public school. And we ended up going to different high schools, and we remained close for a few years, but eventually kind of went in different paths and stayed in touch every now and then through the years. But in the last few years, especially with me living in Ottawa for a few decades, we had lost touch. And we reunited in sad circumstances, unfortunately, at my father's celebration of life in 2018. He saw it and showed up, which I really appreciated. And we reconnected. We've been chatting. And I asked him if he would take part in this to recall his memories from the Costello show as he came with us and my older siblings. And so, anyway, thanks to Autobahn. And that name comes from each one of us kind of had this thing where we were here in Canada, but part of his family was German and my family came from England. So we both had this big influence of Europe, the different places of Europe our families were from, mixed with our contemporary life in Canada. And also that Kraftwerk album came out and the song Autobahn in 75 when I knew him. So I've used that name as the nom de plume. So anyway, here it is, take it away to my interview with Autobahn. So I'm chatting now with Autobahn, who we went to public school in London, Ontario in the 70s. I'll say at Evelyn Harrison Public School. And say hi, Autobahn.
Hi, various artists.
Yes, that's about it. So we're going to talk about this concert, this Elvis Costello concert that we went to in 1978, along with my elder siblings. Now, was this your first concert?
Yes, definitely my first real rock concert.
Because I thought about this after. I was wondering if that was the case. Maybe tell us a bit about your life at the time, sort of maybe give us a snapshot of where you were at this point in your life.
Well, it was 1978, so I was 16. Would have been grade 10 in high school. We went to separate high schools.
Yeah.
So, but we stayed in contact for a while.
Yes.
As I did
first
with
few years.
Public school guys. I tried to, anyways, for a while.
Yeah.
Eventually, that faded off. But I just always wanted to see a live show. You got me into all that music, especially Costello. And so I don't remember whose idea it was. It was probably your idea. You probably had thought, oh, I'll get a ticket for Rob. And
well, I know that probably my brother would have gotten tickets, and I probably would have asked you, do you want to come?
Yeah, I think that's probably how it went. And he had an old house somewhere, I think, in Old North, because I remember him coming down the stairs. Like it was an old place. I thought that your brother's house was somewhere in Old North.
No, it's in Old South, actually Emery Street.
Okay, so that's an old area too.
Yeah.
So my memory is very fuzzy about like those kind of details. But I do remember walking into Alumni Hall and just thinking how huge it was. I wasn't expecting that. Probably it was easily the biggest audience I've ever been into. And like and then once the show started, the lighting, the sound, all that was just all quite amazing to me because I hadn't seen it. I'd only seen that on TV, right?
Right.
I've never seen anything like that live.
And back then, especially London back then, we did get, actually on one hand, for the size of the city, we did get a number of shows because it's equidistant between Detroit and Toronto, but we didn't get a ton also for that reason, because sometimes if they needed an extra night, they'd end up in London, but it also precluded a lot of other places because they would be playing, and mostly people just traveled to one of those two cities for the bigger shows.
Well, I also remember London being a very, they wouldn't buy advance tickets. A lot of people would just buy tickets at the door. And do you remember that? And then because I remember we were trying to get XTC to come and they wouldn't come, and Simple Minds and stuff like that. Some of them eventually made it here. Yeah.
Well, okay, there's two different points there that you brought up. One was about not buying advance tickets. Honestly, I'd forgotten about that, and you're right.
Yeah.
I had totally forgotten. This used to be London's a weird place on many levels.
Yeah.
That's why we were a test market. And for years we were a test market, which I thought was cool at the time until I later found out that basically if you're a test market, it means your city's really screwed up.
Yeah, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
Actually, more that to have a test market, you need a lot of social isolation within a city. Whereas like most cities, there's a lot more cross-pollination, but London's very closed up. So that's why it made a good test market, because everyone was so isolated from each other here, which is not a healthy thing. It also connects to why we had the greatest per capita mass murderers for a few decades as well.
And now I know eventually in the 80s, In Excess, they figured that out. They figured out that we would show up at the door. So they played, I think, at least twice at Alumni Hall, and it was sold out eventually. So, when some bands found that out, and so they would come here for a show. But we had very few decent venues as well.
Yeah. Exactly.
That was the two things.
And also for myself, especially as you start getting into the late 70s and the punk period, where I was listening to a lot more cult-sized bands. To play here, you would have had an audience of a few hundred, and there you had the small clubs, and then you had the proper halls like Alumni and Centennial, that sort of 800 to 1,000 in between. The only thing we had was Wonderland Gardens, and unless my memory fails me, in the 70s, and I don't recall that being used for a lot of shows. It happened again in the 80s, but my memory, I can't remember much happening there after the mid-70s. Maybe they went through a period of not booking shows, but we were limited in what we had here.
Yeah, and the only other venue I remember was the London Gardens.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Did I say London Gardens or Wonderland Gardens?
You said Wonderland Gardens.
Sorry, the London Gardens in the South End. My mistake. And that was big shed.
Yeah.
And I was actually there 6 months before this because concert number 2 is Bob Seger, which isn't, I'll be recording. This will now have aired when we're doing that. But
Right.
and the Boomtown Rats came up there. But that was a big 6,000 seater shed with poor heating and terrible sound.
Exactly. Yeah. Poor acoustics. Alumni Hall was decent acoustics.
Yes. Centennial had pretty lousy acoustics too. I think they may have worked on that.
They did, because a certain famous show I saw there that was really good sound. And sound technology improves too along the way. Oh, I was mentioning when I saw the Smiths there in '86. And I was disappointed that they were going there because I knew the acoustics would be bad. But they somehow got around that. And I'm sure they had top-notch equipment for the day as well.
Well, I'll be coming back to you with that show because that's coming down the line. And that's actually it's one of the first shows I have where I wrote a letter to a friend of mine that I ended up not sending right after the show. And it's a detailed description of the show. So I'm so glad I didn't send this. But what you were saying about the ticket thing, what comes into mind about London was, I think it was 82, Joan Armatrading was touring her Walk Under Ladders album. And she was, a fairly big artist here in Canada, like, decent sized artist. And the whole tour was a sellout because that was one of her biggest albums here in Canada, except for London, which she had to cancel because the advance ticket sales were so low.
But I bet if she showed up, we all would have showed up. Do you know what I mean?
And that probably is one of the reasons bands didn't book here a ton, is because of that.
Yeah, I think that is exactly.
But Simple Minds did come here.
Yeah, I did. I think now, did XTC ever make it here? I don't think
so. That's actually coming up on another list, 20 shows that I missed. They were coming. It was the fall of 1980. I had tickets. They canceled at the last minute. And basically the tour was canceled because that's when Andy Partridge's stage fright went through the roof and he just couldn't perform anymore.
Yes, I recall that. Yeah.
And we did not find out until we got to the venue. There's actually a really funny story about that, but I'll save that for another time.
What was the venue?
Centennial Hall. And Simple Minds played at Freifogel's in 81.
Yes, Freifogel's. Yes. I saw some shows at Freifogel's, yeah.
1983, the last year it was open, I pretty much almost lived there. There's so much coming up from that last year. And we saw Simple Minds when they played here a couple of years ago down at Budweiser Gardens. Right. And Jim Kerr brought that show up, the Freifogel show. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, they tend to do that.
Well, a lot of them, it's such a blur. Like we saw the Psychedelic Furs last summer.
Yeah, I was there.
Oh, you were there?
At London Music Hall?
Yes.
Yeah, I was at that.
Great show.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that they had played here, but he'd forgotten the show, which is interesting because unfortunately, I couldn't go to those shows. But they played 2 nights at the Cedar Lounge, and they really, I know that was impacted a lot of people on the local scene. They were, especially the Zealots who opened for them. But that was a very important show for the scene in London at that time. And it was a tiny venue and they played 2 nights. But, of course, that was lost to time because it's thousands of shows they've played since.
Do you remember where we sat at the Elvis Costello concert? Kind of halfway up.
3/4 of the way back, but on the incline part of Alumni.
Right.
I have my ticket for this posted up on the blog. So if you go look at it, you'll actually be able to see the row and seat because it should be on the ticket.
Right, yeah.
And I also believe the ticket is $7.
Yes, I know.
So how did you so maybe talk about Elvis Costello and being a fan of Elvis Costello. I think I introduced you to him, but what was it that interested you about him? What did you like about his music? Any memories of first hearing his music, that sort of thing?
Yes. What I remember is you were in England and you brought back the Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks.
Actually, no.
No?
Because that didn't come out till after I came back. I brought a bunch back, but I told you about the Sex Pistols, and I played them for you when I bought the album.
Oh, okay. That must have been it. But it was all very in a pretty short frame time. I wouldn't say all in like the same night or same day. I just remember those two albums, that like Elvis Costello's "My Aim Was True," and I liked his voice. His songs were short, and I tend to gravitate to the pop side of music, but I like sort of like alternative pop, a bit of an oxymoron there, but it's that's what I gravitate to, and I just liked his songs, his style, everything.
And then, of course, he was one of the first to sort of blow up from England, one of the few who blew up from England, because he had mainstream success here pretty quickly. And then, of course, there was the Saturday Night Live appearance in December of 77, where I think a lot of people learned about him.
Right.
Or he was covering for the Sex Pistols, who couldn't get the work visas for the show.
Well, he had just come out with this year's motto when we saw him, right?
Yes.
And though that was an album I went out and got on my own, and continued to collect Elvis Costello for quite a few years. But ironically enough, I have not seen him live since that first show. Yeah,
That's what blows me away.
yeah,
Because, and this is not something I intended, it's just worked out this way. I see Elvis Costello once every decade. This show actually for me was the weakest of the lot. It was high energy, but I felt there was something high energy, but kind of on autopilot, I found at times. Especially the roller coaster he'd been on. He was probably exhausted by this point.
oh yeah, could be very well why that. I don't recall that. Of course, I had nothing to compare it to. You know.
And everyone interprets things
Yeah.
different anyway.
Yeah.
What would you think was some of his best recordings, his best albums? Do you have favorite albums or songs or?
It's mostly the early stuff I like, you know, similar to Elton John. You know, I didn't like anything after Island Girl with Elton John, and it's kind of the same with Elvis Costello. I kind of fell out of favor with him after his first few albums. So, and I think his he wasn't it Trust, I think, that where he went into country music a bit.
No, it was the one after that. But I like country music, so.
Yeah. Well, now that I've gotten older, I have appreciation of it more. But back in the 80s and 90s, I did not. I didn't like country music at all.
His 80s output was erratic, but some of my favorite albums from that period, like Just Get Happy, Imperial Bedroom's my absolute favorite. The one after it is fantastic. I can see the cover. Beat the Clock from 83 with Every Day I Write the Book. And then at the end of the decade, he did Spike. Oh, and King of America. That's one of my favorite Elvis Costello albums, King of America. Right. So, you know, he had a really he's had such an interesting and varied career because he went into work in a multiple genres.
Yes, that's what makes him very interesting, especially as I get older and I can appreciate more genres of music, because another genre I didn't like very much was jazz. It was very difficult for my ear to catch on to that. And some of my favorite artists are big fans of jazz. So it's another one that I'm just slowly, gradually getting into. But yes, that and Elvis Costello's show that he had, I think he made 12 episodes.
Yes.
And I found that extremely interesting. I even liked the one with the country artists on it. Nora Jones, John Mellencamp, and there was Johnny Cash's daughter.
Lou Reed was on.
Yeah, that was all very fascinating to me.
Yeah, Elton John. That was a great series. That really was an amazing series.
It was.
He's still just an incredible performer. Every other show has been really high energy, and also because so many of his songs are short, he's playing like almost 30 songs in a set list, 25, 30 songs in a set list.
Right.
And just great spirit. He's still with he's now with the Imposters, which is the Attractions with a different bass player, because I know he and Bruce Thomas had a falling out. But live, oh man, he's really something else.
I want to see him again for sure. There was a show, I think, in Detroit that I was looking at. I was going to buy tickets, and then he was sick or something. Anyways, the show was canceled. So when this COVID thing's over, I'm I'm going to be looking out for anything within like 200 miles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was really disappointed because he toured Imperial Bedroom a few years ago and he played the whole album, but it was just the timing was all wrong. It was just bad timing, couldn't go. And I was so disappointed because if that's literally any Elvis Costello tour I'd like to see, that was it. But, oh well, I've seen him 5 times. I can't complain. Though the one thing that's weird about this gig, that this is the only time I've seen him inside 4 walls. All other times I've seen him have been at big outdoor gigs.
Yes, and that's exactly the kind of gigs that I did not like very much, the festivals. And unfortunately, that's where you could see a lot of these guys, at least in this part of the world. That's the big thing.
And of course, I am a complete festival junkie. When I lived in Ottawa for years, the main reason I loved living in Ottawa is we had 3 major festivals every year, and so many acts came in. And in the years I lived there, well, I saw him there twice.
You know, I that's another thing. London didn't have a lot of them, and I would have been going to Toronto or somewhere else to see a decent festival. I was going to tell you about the Costello concert. I do remember bragging about it for many years. Because, I mean, some people might say, oh, my first concert was, what was a bubblegum band back then? The guys from Britain. Can't remember.
Bay City Rollers?
Yeah, Bay City, yeah, Bay City Rollers. But I could say that my first concert was Elvis Costello. And that I had that cool factor to it, right?
So it's like you also saw him very early on because lots of people have seen him, but not tons of people were able to see him on those first few tours because he was playing smaller venues. So, all right. Okay. Well, thanks once again.
All right. Yeah. And a nice distraction about what's going on right now. So bye-bye.
Thank you, Autobahn, for taking time to be interviewed through Skype. Great catching up with you again. And also, he will be coming back for a few gigs down the line that we were both at for his input on those. For me, as with the Seger gig, this show was anticlimactic, although for completely different reasons. Whereas with Seger, I just wasn't feeling it, and I was just uninterested in what he was doing. It's not that his performance was bad, just this isn't what I was about and just wasn't into it. This time around, it seems as if the situations were reversed. I was really up for a great show and really wanted to see Costello, but he seemed to be going through the motions. He and the attractions steamrolled through many of the expected numbers, such as Pump It Up, Watching the Detectives, Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes, but the set kind of came off as punching the clock to me. It was just the sense. The high energy was there, but it seemed forced. And the frenetic pace of most of the tunes didn't suggest inspiration so much as they just kind of wanted to get through it. Kind of reminds me of the Beatles, where when they were playing, those shows that were, half an hour, and they would tell themselves backstage, look, if we do this fast, we can be off in 25 minutes. And that's kind of my takeaway from the show. But you know what? Consider the following. I did some online peeking around into his schedule at that time, and I'm just not surprised the show maybe wasn't his best, because he was pretty much on the road continually through the year while also recording. And by this stage in the game, we're in November. Some autopiloting has to be involved just simply to get you through this endless sea of gigs. He must have been so exhausted. He and the whole band must have been so exhausted and burnt out by this point that, he gave the energy, but, you can only do so much, and eventually you're just winding down. So I guess the set concluded following an encore and the lights came on. And I was really pleased that I'd gotten to see him, that I'd been in this hall, that I'd finally seen a new wave act. Yet something just felt lacking. I hadn't found that feeling that I'd been looking for in the earlier in 78 with Seger. It didn't quite seem to have that same feeling of magic as when I saw Roxy Music. However, it must be noted that this show inaugurated an unintentional tradition wherein I see Elvis Costello precisely once per decade. And he's coming up down the line is the next show in 1980 at the Heatwave Festival. That's concert number 8, and that's the 40th anniversary of the Heatwave Festival this year. And I'm going to have something special, a few special things happening for that anniversary later in the year. In the 90s, I saw him at Canada's Wonderland with the Replacements. That's show number 72. I thought both acts were fantastic, although it was disparaged in Trouble Boys. They didn't like the Replacements set, the book about the Replacements. 2003, concert number 101, saw him at Blues Fest, and concert number 161 in 2011 at the Ottawa Jazz Festival. So once again, I have a appointment with Elvis. After this night, I started to sour a bit on Costello for a while, and this concert had a lot to do with it. I just felt, I don't know, a little bit disappointed, and that changed decisively. We'll talk about the Heatwave Festival later in the year, but he came out and delivered a performance there that just left this one in the dust. Fantastic. Coming up later in the year. So this concludes episode 8, and thanks to Audubon for dropping by, sharing his memories. He'll be coming up in some episodes later down the line. Next time in episode 9, I'm going to be looking at a show with a band who were an even bigger obsession for me through this whole time than even Costello. And episode 9 is concert number 4. This is The Modern World, The Jam, with the Dwight Twiley Band at the Rex Danforth Theatre, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Tuesday, April 10th, 1979. They were touring behind what I think is their best album, All Mod Cons, and their then new 45, Strangetown. Tune in for Winkle Pickers, Opening Act Confusion, and The Magic Returns. I'm your host, Various Artists, here at the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast, and thank you for listening. I'd like to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to us on Facebook and Instagram. Check out our YouTube channel and the MyLifeInConcert.com website and the original blog entry there where there's photos, scans, my original ticket, blah, blah, blah. Let's meet up at the next show. Bye for now.